The cold stone corridors of Topkapi Palace stretch before you like a living maze, their walls heavy with the weight of secrets and sorrow. The morning light, once radiant, now felt muted, filtered through latticed windows that cast fractured patterns on the marble floors, a kaleidoscope of beauty that barely masked the dread that lingered in the air. Today is no ordinary day in the imperial harem. Today a new girl will be led through these corridors, her fate sealed by the sultan's whim and the capricious politics of the court. She is Aishi, barely 15, with wide dark eyes and trembling hands. Born the daughter of a minor provincial bey, she arrived weeks ago in Istanbul, her world reduced to the grand courtyard of the palace, where eunuchs and guards moved like silent shadows. She was told she had been chosen to serve His Majesty, an honor she could neither refuse nor comprehend. All she knows is the ritual that awaits her, the endless baths to render her body pure, the lessons in etiquette so she might please her future master, and above all, the knowledge that her worth now lies in her obedience and silence. As Aishi steps forward, the eunuch Khatib gestures for her to halt. He is gaunt, his eyes hollow from years of enforcing the Sultan's will. "Remember, child," he whispers, "your life is no longer your own." His words slither into her mind, planting seeds of fear that bloom in her chest like black roses. The harem is more than a place of pleasure. It is a crucible designed to break the will of every woman within its walls, forging them into vessels of obedience, loyalty, and secrecy. Behind the heavy cedar doors of her assigned suite, Aishi is stripped of her simple linen dress and stepped into a warm marble bath scented with rosewater and ambergris. The bath girls move with practiced grace, washing her trembling limbs, brushing her hair until it gleams like dark silk. They whisper the rules as they go: no laughter without permission, no tears allowed, no words spoken in defiance. Each command is a thread in the web that will hold her captive. When the bath is complete, she is wrapped in fine silk and adorned with bracelets of gold and coral, gifts from distant governors who hope to curry favor through her. Her first lesson in the art of pleasing a sultan unfolds in a small, windowless chamber, lit only by flickering oil lamps. Here she is shown how to curtsy just so, how to lower her gaze at precisely the right moment, and how to modulate her voice into a soft purr that can both beguile and soothe. Every movement is observed by the senior concubine Julia, a woman in her 30s whose beauty has aged like a funereal bloom. Once vibrant, now edged with the sharp lines of grief and regret. "You are property of the throne," Julia intones, her voice devoid of warmth. "Your body belongs to the sultan, your mind belongs to the state, your silence belongs to the palace." Aishi nods, her eyes brimming with tears she dare not shed, for in these walls, tears are seen as weakness, and weakness is punished with exile to the cages of Mustafa Pasha's guards, the basement dungeon where those who displease the Sultan are kept until they wither or break. That evening, the ritual known as the presenting of the roses takes place in the grand hall of the harem. Eunuchs parade the new girls before the Sultan on a gilded dais, each girl holding a single crimson rose. Sultan Murad IV, his face veiled by shadow and cruelty, selects from among them those who will live to see another dawn. The rose he plucks from a girl's hand is a death sentence. She will be cast into the palace's less trodden wings, never to return. AC watches in horror as two girls collapse at his feet, one overcome by fear, the other stricken by despair. Their fate is decided even before they leave the dais. When her turn comes, Aishi's heart pounds so violently it feels as though the veins in her throat will burst. She steps forward, extends the rose with trembling fingers, and waits. Murad's gaze pierces her like a dagger. For a moment, time fractures, and she glimpses the countless souls crushed beneath the Sultan's caprice. Then, with unexpected gentleness, he takes her rose and nods. Aishi's knees give way, and she collapses, her relief mingled with terror at the uncertainty that still awaits her. Back in her chamber, Aishi is given a small volume of verses, love poetry in Persian. She is instructed to memorize each line, for the Sultan takes pleasure in being serenaded in the dead of night. The poetry is beautiful, a dazzling tapestry of longing and devotion, yet Aishi's lips taste of ash as she recites the words, knowing they are meant for the man who holds her life in his hand. The eunuch Khatib stands sentinel at the door, his expression unreadable as ever. Days slip into weeks, each one a trial of Aishi's spirit. She learns the subtle politics of the harem, how to win favor with the favorites who walk the marble galleries with whispered secrets, how to offer gifts of honeyed pastries or rare fabrics without inciting jealousy. She discovers that friendship here is as treacherous as poison. Alliances forged in a heartbeat can shatter just as quickly when the sultan's caprice shifts like desert sands in a summer wind. Food is scarce, reserved for those who have the sultan's ear. Aishi subsists on stale bread and diluted broth, until one evening a kindly older concubine slips her a sprig of mint, a gesture so small it almost undoes Aishi's resolve. Yet even kindness here is laced with danger. Favor today can become scorn tomorrow, and a whispered rumor is enough to send a woman tumbling into disgrace. The first time the sultan visits, Aishi's world fractures. The door to her chamber opens without knock or warning. Murad enters, his silhouette framed by torchlight, and the eunuch Khatib closes the door behind him with a finality that echoes around Aishi's heart. He hovers by the window, silent and still, a living statue guarding the nightmare about to unfold. Murad approaches Aishi with a deliberate slowness, as though savoring her fear. "Stand," he commands, and Aishi obeys, her legs stiff as iron rods. He circles her, inspecting her like a merchant appraising a costly rug. She feels the weight of his gaze, as heavy as chains around her wrists. When he finally speaks, his voice is low and measured. "You will learn loyalty," he says. "You will learn obedience. You will learn silence." He lays a single finger beneath her chin, raising her face to his. Aishi trembles, her breath catching in her throat. The moment stretches out, an eternity of vulnerability and dread. Then Murad steps back, his features unreadable. "Dress," he commands. And just like that, the performance is over. After he departs, Aishi collapses onto her low divan, her body slick with sweat, her mind thundering with questions. Was this love? Was this power? Or was it simply another step in the endless ritual of her subjugation? She forces herself to rise and dress, each movement stiff with shock and shame. Night falls again, but sleep does not come. Aishi lies awake on her silken mattress while the distant murmur of laughter drifts through the palace walls. Somewhere, another girl is being escorted through the same dance of terror she endured. Above her, the stars wheel silently, indifferent to the lives held captive beneath them. By dawn, Aishi's tears have dried, but her fear remains etched into her bones. She knows that tomorrow, the cycle will begin anew. The baths, the lessons, the petals presented on gilded platters, the sultan's silent appraisal. She will learn to steel herself, to erect walls of indifference, for those who weep here are remembered and punished. And yet, in the darkest hours, a fragile flame of hope flickers within her, a memory of her mother who whispered once before the caravan left their village, "You are stronger than they know. Hold fast to who you are." Aishi clings to those words like a lifeline, refusing to let her spirit break entirely beneath the palace's crushing weight. This is the first chapter of the nightmare life of the Sultan's concubines, a world of opulent prisons and gilded despair, where every breath is borrowed and every heartbeat risks calling the Sultan's attention. For Aisha, and for the hundreds of young girls who will follow, survival depends not on strength of body, but on the resilience of the soul. And in this palace of shadows, that may be the greatest act of defiance imaginable. The dawn chill still clung to the marble balustrades of the harem's inner courtyard when Aishi awoke on the third day of her confinement. The dawn here never felt gentle, only an abrupt reminder that another cycle of servitude and spectacle awaited. She rose silently from her low divan, careful not to disturb the folded silks beneath her, and crossed the room to peer through the latticework window. Beyond the rose gardens, the Bosphorus glinted like a blade, its currents reminding her that, outside these walls, life still pulsed free. Inside, she remained a prisoner of beauty and fear. Her first task before the midday sun climbed overhead was to assist with the morning offerings. A line of concubines filed into the courtyard, each carrying a shallow brass tray laden with figs, pomegranates, and sweetmeats. They knelt before the marble fountain, its waters teeming with carp, and began the ritual chant of gratitude to the Sultan's ancestors. Aishi joined them, whispering the verses in a tongue she barely knew, her voice cracking with uncertainty. The senior concubine Hoya watched from the dais, her dark eyes narrowing at every misstep. A stifled cough, a hesitated line, and Aishi felt the weight of scrutiny crush her chest. Beneath the flicker of torchlight, every face was a mirror reflecting her flaws. After the offerings, Aishi was led by the eunuch Khateb to the chamber of mirrors, a vast hall lined with polished bronze plates that turned every movement into a shifting tableau of light and shadow. Here, the concubines practiced the art of presentation. The tilt of the head, the gentle arch of an eyebrow, the almost imperceptible parting of lips. Mirrors multiplied their forms until each girl felt watched from every angle, her posture and expression dissected by invisible critics. Aishi found the exercise maddening. Her body ached from standing poised, muscles trembling as she repeated the same curtsy 100 times. Yet she learned to hide her fatigue behind a mask of serene composure, for any display of weakness could be used against her. By mid-afternoon, the lessons turned to music. Aishi's slender fingers closed around the neck of a small oud, its strings humming under her touch. Music was the Sultan's secret delight. He prized novelty and talent above all else, so each girl strove to master an instrument or vocal style. Aishi struggled to produce more than discordant notes, her mind fogged by hunger and the day's anxieties. Yet she pressed on, recalling her mother's gentle hands teaching her to hum lullabies long ago. Those memories fueled her determination. She practiced until her arms burned, until the oud's voice grew smooth and mournful. When at last she plucked the final chord and silence fell, Julia nodded once, an almost imperceptible sign of approval that felt like a triumph. The late afternoon sun found her in the herb garden, kneeling on cool tesserae to 10 rows of basil, mint, and hyssop. The palace physicians prized these plants for their healing properties, and the concubines were taught basic apothecary arts, how to crush leaves into poultices, how to infuse oils for massage, how to brew teas that soothed fevers or calmed nerves. Aishi's hands bled from the sharp stems, but she welcomed the minor pain as a distraction. Here, amid the scent of earth and herbs, she could almost forget the gilded bars of her prison. As dusk approached, she was summoned to the Sultan's private gallery, a narrow hall hung with tapestries from Shirvan and Damascus, scenes of battle and courtly revelry. Only a handful of favorites entered this space, and the air was thick with incense and tension. Murad, the fourth, reclined on a low divan, his silhouette rigid against the riot of color behind him. He did not speak as Aishi knelt and recited the verses of Hafiz, her voice echoing in the hush. When she finished, he remained silent, his gaze pinned to the ground. It was a silence far more terrifying than any tirade. In it lay the power to bless or condemn. "Your voice carries truth," he murmured at last, his words a knife's feather. "Yet it lacks fire." Aishi felt her heart seize. "Learn passion," he continued, "or forget that you ever drew breath in my palace." With that, he waved her away. She rose, her knees throbbing, and backed out of the gallery, each step a prayer for mercy and a vow to do better. That night, Aishi lay awake on her mattress of silken damask, the scent of jasmine drifting through the open window. She clutched the small volume of Persian poetry to her chest, turning its pages by lamplight until sleep claimed her, or so she hoped. Instead, she dreamt of running through the palace corridors, her bare feet slipping on cold stone as voices laughed far above, and doors slammed shut at every turn. She awoke gasping, her sheets clinging to her skin with sweat, and reminded herself that dreams could be as cruel as reality. Weeks turned to months, and with each passing season, Aishi discovered new layers to the harem's cruelty and cunning. Rivalries bloomed like poisoned flowers. Aisol, with her pale skin and fragile beauty, won Murad's favor by bringing him rare silk from Khorasan. She laughed too freely, and Aishi learned that laughter was another weapon, one that could wound deeper than any blade. Layla, once Aishi's friend in the baths, found herself exiled to the palace kitchens after rumors spread that she had whispered encouragements to the new girls. No one admitted to sowing those rumors, yet in the harem, guilt was a contagion that spread without source. Aishi, striving to survive, became both student and spy, learning which whispers to heed, which alliances to guard, and which doors to knock on when the Sultan's favor shifted like a mirage. She observed the older concubines with wary admiration. Zubaydah, whose calm smile disguised a mind as sharp as any dagger. Fatma, who carved secret messages into the ivory combs of her hair to send to her family beyond the sea. And Hulya, whose stern tutelage concealed a loneliness so profound it seeped through her every command. From them, Aishi gleaned that strength often lay not in resistance, but in choosing one's battles with care. The most dangerous lesson came with childbirth. When Rumaysa, a favored concubine, went into labor in the dead of winter, the harem hushed in a blend of fear and anticipation. A child born here would be the Sultan's heir, a mother elevated to a position beyond the reach of envy, or crushed under its weight if the child died. Aishi watched as Rumaysa was carried in a litter to the chamber, wrapped in blankets and supported by physicians. For days the palace trembled, every heartbeat a whisper of life or death. When at last the cries of a newborn wailed through the halls, relief swept the harem like wind through reeds. Rumaysa's status rose instantly. Her coifs now bore jewels heavier than her former shoes, and the Sultan visited her daily, his eyes alight with boastful pride. Aishi's own body had not yet ripened for motherhood, though she felt its call and dreams of children she would never know. She tended Rumaysa's needs, pouring spiced wine for her strength, crushing basil for her pains, reciting lullabies borrowed from her mother's tongue. In each act of care, Aishi found a bittersweet solace. To nurture another was both blessing and curse, for in the harem, compassion could be as dangerous as ambition. A single act of kindness, observed or reported, could earn the Sultan's favor, or arouse the jealousy that bred plots in shadowed alcoves. Spring arrived at last, and with it, the festival of Nowruz. The harem bloomed with color, carpets strewn with hyacinths, trays of gold coins scattered alongside sweet nuts, and every concubine dressed in her finest robes. Aishi stood among them, her skirts of emerald silk swirling at her ankles, her hair braided with threads of silver. She carried a cup of rosewater, its fragrance sweet and heady, and offered it to the Sultan as he passed on his way to the palace gardens. When Murad took the cup and drank, he paused, his gaze settling on her with something like curiosity. "You have learned much," he said, and for a moment Aishi dared to believe she had truly earned his respect. But respect in the harem was as fragile as spun sugar. That night, a minstrel's song fell wrong, and the Sultan's mood turned as swiftly as a falcon's dive. Aishi, attending to his sideboard, trembled as he struck the table with his fist, demanding the singer's head. Blood dripping onto the rugs, the singer's lifeblood a stark testament to the Sultan's caprice. Aishi realized that nothing in this palace was certain except its cruelty. She fled to her chamber at dawn, her robes damp with dew as she closed the door behind her. Outside, birds sang of freedom. Inside, cages held every woman who dared to hope too loudly. Aishi sank onto her divan, her mind racing. The harem had taught her to steel her heart, to speak only when spoken to give the smallest gift of loyalty and to collect it carefully like coins in a purse. But steel could crack under too many blows, and coins could be stolen in the dark. In the weeks that followed, Aishi set herself a new goal, to survive with her spirit intact. She became adept at disappearing into the shadows of the corridors when the Sultan's tantrums flared, at slipping into the kitchens to taste the sweet rice pudding not meant for her lips, and at memorizing the palace's hidden passages so she could walk alone under the moon. Each stolen moment of autonomy was a victory against the palace's hunger for submission. And yet, even as she plotted escape in her heart, Aishi knew that escape was more than physical. It was a matter of reclaiming her own story. The harem might own her body, dictate her movements, and force her into obedience, but it could never fully erase the woman she was before the grand cedar doors closed behind her. In stolen breaths of prayer, she whispered her mother's name. In secret scrawls on dust-covered ledges, she etched bits of her own history. And in the quiet triumph of a flawless UD performance or an unbroken chant of poetry, she claimed pieces of herself back from the Sultan's palace. This is the second chapter of Aishi's nightmare life, a tapestry woven from beauty and brutality, from obedience and quiet rebellion. In the next act, the tides will turn once more. Alliances will shift, loyalties will be tested by fire, and the very foundations of the harem will tremble beneath the weight of secrets long kept. But for now, Aishi holds fast to the fiercest weapon she possesses, hope that, in a world built to consume her, her spirit may yet endure. The flicker of torchlight danced across the cedar-paneled walls of the women's audience chamber as Aishi entered, her breath steady though her heart thundered. News had arrived that morning. Sultan Murad IV would depart for the Anatolian campaign at dusk, leaving the palace in the hands of his Grand Vizier, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. In Murad's absence, the harem would feel the tension of a half-open cage, its occupants both liberated from immediate fear and exposed to new dangers. Aishi paused at the threshold, steeling herself for the storm of intrigue that would follow. Across the room, Hulya stood like a statue carved in ivory and iron, her eyes calculating. At her side, the young favorite Aysel trembled, clutching the rosewood box in which she kept the Sultan's personal seal. Aysel's favor had soared in recent weeks. Her whispered counsel and seductive dances had captivated Murad's ear. Rumor said that Aysel planned, before the campaign's end, to secure her position by naming an heir in secret correspondence with distant Shirvanshah. Word of such ambition spread through the harem like wildfire, igniting fear and envy in equal measure. Hulya's voice was silk over steel. "Aisi," she said, "you have learned much in these moons. You will serve as my attendant during the Sultan's absence. You will guard my petitions, deliver my messages, and watch Aysel's every move." Aisi inclined her head, fighting the urge to betray relief. To serve Hulya directly was a boon, proximity to power, protection under her austere patronage, but it also meant walking the razor's edge between loyalty and suspicion. The first task of the afternoon was to seal and dispatch Hulya's missives. Aishi fastened the wax seal, a double crescent entwined with a rose, and tucked the folded papers into her tunic. Outside the chamber, eunuchs whispered that Hulya's letters contained incriminating details, proof that Aysel had stolen jewels from the Sultan's private treasury, evidence that could send her into exile or worse. Aishi felt the weight of the papers against her side, a small but potent reminder that in this palace, words could kill. She took the corridor toward the Grand Vizier's apartments, each torch casting her shadow in grotesque multiples against the alabaster floor. Eunuchs and pages darted aside at her approach, their eyes flicking with curiosity and calculation. At the ornate gate, she presented Hulya's seal to the gate eunuch, who bowed twice before slipping the letters through the narrow slot. With that, Aishi's first mission under Hulya's command was complete, yet as she turned to leave, a soft hand grasped her sleeve. It was Fatma, the concubine whose gentle mien belied a mind honed by survival. She leaned close, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Beware Aysel's eyes," Fatma warned. "They follow you even when you think she sleeps." Aishi nodded, pressing a finger to her lips. Fatma's warning was one more thread in the web closing around them all. By nightfall, the harem glowed with oil lamps and the scent of jasmine. The concubines gathered in the private gardens for a farewell ceremony to the departing sultan, a ritual of ritualized submission that masked the undercurrents of rebellion. Aishi stood among them in emerald silk, the hem of her gown brushing dew-kissed grass. She watched as Murad descended the marble steps, his armored silhouette framed by guards and pages. He paused before the dais, his gaze sweeping over the concubines, each heart there stilled, hoping to catch his favor one last time. The ceremony began with the offering of gold coins, small ingots poured into a gilded brazier to burn for the Sultan's swift victory. When their trays reached Murad, each girl bowed deeply, her forehead grazing the cool stone. Aysel placed her coins with a languid grace. Murad's hand lingered on her wrist before he accepted the offering. A hush fell as he spoke her name, an honor that caused jealous murmurs to ripple through the ranks. Aishi stepped forward next, presenting a single rose dipped in saffron oil. Murad's eyes flicked to her and then away, and she half expected indifference. Instead, his lips curved in a faint smile. "Keep hope," he said, so softly that only she could hear. The words burned warmer than fire against her ear. In that moment, she felt both uplifted and terrified. Murad's private attention was a gift laden with peril. Hours later, the last oars of Murad's galley slipped into the mist on the Bosphorus. The palace walls, which had echoed with celebrations, fell into an uneasy quiet. Aishi returned to her chamber, where she found Hulya waiting with a cup of rosewater honey. "Tonight," Hulya murmured, "you learn the most dangerous art of all." She gestured to the darkened window. Through its lattice, the silhouette of Aisel's suite flickered with candlelight. In the absence of the Sultan, power shifts to the domestic realm. Alliances will form and shatter. Listen, watch, and tell me everything. For the next fortnight, Aishi became both observer and spy. At dawn, she studied the shifting groupings in the courtyard, Aizel leaning close to the Grand Vizier's nephew, whispering over a board of chess pieces. Zubaydah slipping into the kitchens to leave a pouch of saffron for the head cook's gratitude. Layla, recently restored to favor, parading with new jewels rumored to be gifts from sympathizers beyond the palace gates. Each encounter was a stanza and a silent poem of ambition, jealousy, and survival. Aishi noted the timing of every meeting: early mornings in the ointment room, late nights in the library of forbidden verse. She learned that the eunuch Khatep possessed secret access to the palace ovens, where letters could be burned unseen, and that Fatma had hidden caches of dried herbs behind her mattress. Remedies for pain, yes, but also potential poisons. With each discovery, Aishi sent a hawk to Hulya, its feathers stained with secret ink. On the 15th night, as the moon hung low and swollen over the seraglio, Aishi crept to the latticed window of Aisel's suite. Inside, flickering candlelight revealed Aisel in a moment of private vulnerability. Her skirts pooled at her feet, her alabaster shoulders bared, as she leaned over a ledger. The Sultan's seal decorated the cover, proof that she had assumed authority in his absence. Aishi recognized the gravity of what she witnessed. Aisel was now acting as regent in all but name, signing edicts and mobilizing troops. The next morning, the Grand Vizier himself strode into the harem, his robes trailing behind him like a storm cloud. Aishi, stationed at Hulya's side, watched the council that the vizier convened in the women's audience chamber. Deputies presented petitions, requests for food rations, pleas for medical aid, demands for housing repairs. The vizier's voice boomed through the chamber, yet all eyes remained on Aisel as she summarized her plans for tribute and military levies. Her authority was real, undeniable, and terrifying. Hulya's jaw clenched. Aishi saw the calculation in her eyes. The moment to strike had come. Under cover of dusk, Hulya summoned Aishi to the alabaster pavilion beyond the rose gardens. There, she opened her bosom to reveal the letters Aishi had delivered weeks ago, the ones naming Aisel's theft. "These," Hulya said, "will unseat her." She handed Aishi a folded document sealed with a third crescent, an imperial decree forged to bear the Sultan's name. If delivered to the Grand Vizier, it would expose Aisel's crimes and strip her of favor, all before Murad's return. But the decree carried a curse. If Murad challenged its authenticity, Hulya would stand accused of treason. Aishi's gut nodded as she realized the peril of her task. To serve Hulya was to bind herself to a scheme that could topple half the harem, or bury them all in the oubliettes below. Yet refusal was impossible. With trembling fingers, Aishi sealed the parchment in a ribbon-wrapped scroll and tucked it beneath her sash. That night, she ventured through the silent corridors, her lantern casting trembling shadows. Each step brought the memory of Murad's warning. "Learn passion, or forget that you ever drew breath in my palace." The words pulsed through her mind as she slid the scroll into the hands of the vizier's aide, a stooped eunuch she had bribed with saffron months before. The eunuch froze, recognition flashing in his eyes, but Aishi only nodded and retreated into the darkness. The next dawn, chaos erupted. The Grand Vizier's nephew burst into the harem, sweating and wild-eyed. He accused Aitzel of usurping the Sultan's authority, of forging decrees, of plotting to lead armies behind Murad's back. Aicel stood before the assembled concubines, her face drained of color, clutching her rosewood box as if it could shield her from ruin. When the vizier's aide produced Hulya's forged decree, the court erupted in shouts, some in outrage, others in shock. Aishi watched from the sidelines as Aisel was stripped of her robes of favor and her jewels confiscated. Her crystal bowls were emptied, her mirrors shattered. The Rose Court whispered that Aisel would be sent to the palace kitchens to scrub pots until the end of her days. And as the eunuchs dragged her away, her eyes locked with Aishi's in a gaze of betrayal so fierce it seared Aishi's very soul. Hulya emerged from the shadows, regal in her triumph. She glanced at Aishi, her expression inscrutable. The alliance had succeeded. Isil was broken, but at a terrible cost. In toppling one rival, Hulya had reshaped the harem's power structure, and Aisi felt its trembling under her feet. The corridors she walked now hummed with new rumors, that Hulya sought to marry off the next sultan's heir, that she planned to fill the harem with her own kin, that she had bribed the janissaries to enforce her will. Aishi realized with cold clarity that the palace's hunger for ambition was endless, and that anyone who wielded power would soon become a target themselves. She had played her part in the game, but the game never ended. As she returned to her chamber, the morning sun glinted off broken tiles outside the window, little shards of light that seemed to promise both danger and possibility. Inside, she removed the silk scarf from her hair and let it fall in a tangle around her shoulders. She poured herself a cup of mint tea and sipped it slowly, tasting both triumph and dread in its bittersweet warmth. Each sip reminded her of the razor's edge she now walked. Ally today, traitor tomorrow, beloved favorite, castaway widow, prisoner and potential liberator. In the weeks that followed, Aishi continued her service to Hulya, delivering letters and intercepting couriers, always watching for the next shift in favor. She studied the faces of the concubines, Zubaydah's cautious envy, Rumeysa's protected pride as mother of the sultan's child, Fatma's quiet concern, and the ghost of panic that lingered in Isil's former chamber. She learned that in the palace, power bloomed and withered like jasmine, fragrant, fleeting, and capable of poisoning the hand that touched it. But through it all, Aishi held fast to her own secret, the memory of freedom beyond the Bosphorus, of her mother's lullabies, of letters she had smuggled out to her father's lands pleading for rescue. In the palace's suffocating luxury, she nurtured the belief that she was more than a concubine, more than an instrument of intrigue. She was a woman who had stared into the heart of darkness and survived, and one day, she vowed, she would shape her own destiny. This is the third chapter of Aishi's nightmare life, the chapter of power struggles and forged decrees, of betrayal and reluctant triumph. As the Sultan's galley returns with news of victory or defeat, the harem's landscape will shift again. Friends will become enemies, secrets will become weapons, and Aishi must decide whether to wield the power she has learned to claim, or to cast it aside in pursuit of the one thing more dangerous than ambition: freedom. The sun hung low over Topkapi Palace as Sultan Murad IV's galley slipped back into the mist of the Bosphorus, its oars carving silent ripples across the water. The harem, for weeks tense under the Grand Vizier's uneasy stewardship, now held its breath. Aisi crouched at the latticed window of her chamber, watching the familiar silhouette of her master's pavilion appear through the fog. Each paddle stroke carried the promise of new favor or fresh ruin. As the galley grounded on the stone quay, she felt a tremor in her chest, a mixture of dread and longing that had become as natural as her own heartbeat. Inside the palace gates, drums sounded the Sultan's return. Heralds in crimson and gold proclaimed his victories in Anatolia. Masked trumpets echoed through the courtyards. Aishi slipped through corridors bathed in torchlight, her skirts trailing dew-damp silk, moving toward the women's audience chamber where the concubines gathered to greet their lord. The air was charged with perfume and tension, the scent of burning amber, the hush of whispered prayers, the unspoken question on every tongue. Would Murad remember Aishi's presence among the multitude? She found Hulya waiting on the dais, regal in her midnight blue robes, her expression serene but unreadable. At her side stood Rumeysa, clutching her infant son, an heir to the Ottoman throne who gurgled softly, oblivious to the palace's shifting allegiances. A murmur rustled through the audience. The Sultan's firstborn, the child of a concubine elevated for motherhood. Aishi felt a pang of envy, quickly tempered by relief. Rumeysa's rise meant that those aligned with her mother now enjoyed protective shelter. Aishi had served Hulya faithfully through intrigue and betrayal. Now she prayed that her patron's favor would hold against the Sultan's unpredictable temper. When Murad entered, the chamber fell silent. He wore armor spattered with Anatolian dust, his face shadowed by sleep and war. His eyes swept over the assembled women, assessing each as though choosing fresh roses for his throne. Aishi knelt on the marble floor, her hands folded in her lap, her heart a drumbeat in her ears. For a moment their gazes met. His dark eyes held something like recognition. She bowed her head, remembering the night he had whispered, "Keep hope." That single phrase had buoyed her through months of fear and scheming. "Rise," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. Aci obeyed, her limbs stiff from kneeling. Murad approached her, his heavy boots echoing on the stone. He stopped before her, reaching out to lift a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The touch was electric, brief, precise, and suffused with authority. "You served well," he said, almost to himself. Then, as abruptly, he turned away to address the Grand Vizier and the court officials gathered beyond the dais. Relief flooded Aish, mingled with uncertainty. Praise from the Sultan could be a double-edged sword. A sign of favor now might demand a greater debt later. She allowed herself a measured smile, then stepped back into the ranks of concubines, blending once more into the tapestry of veiled faces and hidden ambitions. The days that followed were a dance of ceremonial splendor and concealed maneuvering. Aishi resumed her duties in Hulya's service, carrying petitions to the Sultan's private quarters, deciphering the nuances in his late-night audiences, and tending to Rumeis's needs when the new mother required rest. But beneath the gilded routines, an undercurrent of unrest flowed. Murad, fresh from conquest, bled his treasury dry to reward his generals. Food rations in the palace faltered, and echoes of famine whispered from the kitchens to the harem's corridors. Guards grew surly, eunuchs whispered of mutiny in the janissary barracks. Each rumor tightened the noose of tension around the women of the harem. If the palace fell into chaos, the concubines would be its first victims. One evening, as Aishi walked the gardens under a moon hung like a silver guillotine, Fatma intercepted her by the rose bushes. "The Sultan's patience wanes," Fatma said, her voice a ghostly whisper. "He blames Hulya for the shortages, claims her petitions are too many, her demands too great. He wonders if she sows discontent to bolster her own power." Aishi felt her pulse quicken. The alliance she had forged with Hulya, the bonds of loyalty she had stitched through whispered intelligence and forged letters, each now threatened by Murad's caprice. She pressed a hand to her breast, feeling the thrum of fear beneath her silks. Returning to her chamber, Aishi pondered her next move. To warn Hulya risked marking herself as traitor to the Sultan. To remain silent risked Hulya's wrath and the collapse of the only protection Aishi had known. In the hush of her room, she slipped into her prayer beads and began a silent litany, channeling grief into purpose. She resolved that if Hulya fell from favor, she would not watch idly as a friend was cast into ruin. She would find a path through the palace's labyrinth, no matter how narrow or dark. The turning point came at dawn, when a caravan of yellow-robed officials arrived to audit the harem's stores. Led by the Sultan's accountant, they marched through the corridors, sealing storerooms and tallying flour sacks. The women of the harem gathered in the courtyard, clutching their shawls, faces pale as mourning veils. Aishi stayed close to Rumeis's tent, watching as the stewards locked the doors and threw away the keys. Then the accountant's lieutenant, a stern-faced eunuch, inspected Hulya's private pantry, where jars of clarified butter, honey, and pistachios lay hidden in carved cedar cupboards. A gasp arose from the concubines as the lieutenant pried open a secret panel, revealing the spoils. The Sultan's agent frowned, snapping a chain around the jars. "By imperial decree, these belong to the treasury," he announced, his voice carrying in the still morning. For neglect or hoarding, the holder faces punishment decreed by Sultan Murad himself. The jars were loaded onto camels bound for the palace kitchens. The courtyard echoed with suppressed cries of dismay. Hulya stood stiff and silent, her face a mask, but Aishi saw the fire in her eyes, a promise of vengeance that chilled Aishi's blood. That night, Aishi slipped through secret passages to Hulya's suite. The older concubine sat before her mirror, her reflection fragmented by candles. She wore no jewels, no silks, only a simple white shift that contrasted with the rage in her gaze. "They will strip me of everything," she said, her voice trembling with barely concealed fury, "and then they will come for you." Aci nodded. "I will stand by you," she replied. "We will survive this, as we have survived all else." Julia's lips curved in a bleak smile. "I believe you," she said, "but tomorrow you must deliver a petition to the Sultan himself." She handed Aci a folded scroll stamped with the imperial seal. "Tell him of the bread lines in the kitchens. Tell him of the guards who take meals meant for the concubines. Tell him of the janissaries grumbling." Aci swallowed. "And if he suspects these words came from you?" "Then tell him they came from the heart of the harem," Julia said. "Let his own palace speak against him." At first light, Aci carried the scroll through the palace's sleeping wings toward the grand doors of the Sultan's council chamber. Each footstep felt like thunder in her ears. Guards bowed as she passed. Pages scurried away. She stepped into the chamber where Murad sat astride a sun-dappled dais, his broad shoulders draped in ermine. His generals and viziers stood behind him as silent statues awaiting her words. Aci approached, knelt, and placed the scroll before him. Her voice was steady as she spoke of empty storerooms, of hungry women in gilded cages, of the discontent that simmered beyond the palace walls. Every eye turned to her. Even the Sultan's gaze sharpened. He broke the seal and unfolded the petition. As he read, his expression darkened. Moments passed in charged silence. Then he looked up. "So," he said, his voice low and measured, "the harem speaks." He frowned. "This is not the harem's voice. It is Julia's. She would have me believe her loyalty lies with my subjects." Aci's heart froze. The Sultan's next words would decide their fates. But instead of anger, Murad's eyes shone with something like amusement. He rose, his gilt throne creaking under his weight, and descended to stand before Aci. "Tell Julia," he said, "that she need not petition so boldly." Aci dared to hope. "Your pardon, sire?" Murad reached down to lift her chin, mirroring his first gentle touch months ago. "I will see that the kitchen stores are replenished. I will address the janissaries. I will not have my own palace undone by neglect." He paused, his breath warm against her skin. "And I will remember whose courage spoke truth in this court." Aci felt a rush of relief and awe as he turned and strode from the chamber, the petition still in his hand. In the days that followed, food returned to the larder, and guards relaxed their watchful scowls. Murad sent gifts of ambergris and rosewater to the harem, his subtle apology wrapped in honeyed words. Julia's pantry was restored, her jewels returned, her dignity intact. Aci felt the palace's tension ease, replaced by a fragile peace. Yet she knew better than to trust calm too readily. In Topkapi's halls, even good fortune could shift like sand under a falcon's wing. At dawn on the day of the spring festival, Aci stood in the rose garden beside Rumesa, her hands folded around a cup of saffron wine. The air thrummed with celebration. Dancers twirled on the marble pavilion. Musicians coaxed melodies from qanuns and ney flutes. Courtiers promenaded under garlands of hyacinth. Murad led the procession, offering blessings as he passed, his gaze resting on Aci for a brief moment that spoke volumes of trust earned in tests endured. As the festival reached its crescendo, Aci slipped away to the edge of the water, where the Bosphorus lapped softly at the quay. She knelt and ran her fingers through the cool current, letting its flow remind her of life beyond the palace. Freedom still seemed distant, a dream braided with longing. But she no longer felt powerless. The harem had taught her the language of power, and she had learned to speak it with care. Behind her, Julia joined her by the water's edge, the sun glinting on her silver-streaked hair. She laid a hand on Aci's shoulder, her voice gentle. "You have done more than survive," she said. "You have become my equal in this palace of shadows." Aci turned, meeting Julia's gaze. "I owe you my life," she replied. Julia shook her head. "You owe yourself," she said. "Never forget who you are." Aci watched the Sultan's barge glide past, its sails painted with the crescent moon and star. In that moment, she felt a shift within her, a promise born of trials overcome, of whispered alliances and perilous petitions. The nightmare of the harem had forged her steel, but it had not broken her spirit. She rose, brushing salt water from her fingertips, and squared her shoulders against the coming night. This is the final chapter of Aishi's nightmare life in the Sultan's harem, where every dawn brought new dangers and every dusk demanded survival. Yet in the crucible of opulent prisons, she discovered that even the smallest act of courage could carve a path to freedom, and that hope, once kindled, could never be fully extinguished. The morning air lay heavy over the courtyard of Chateau de Blois, mist curling around the gargoyles that peered down from the ramparts like jaded witnesses to centuries of blood and prayer. A single torch guttered at the entrance to the great hall, its feeble flame trembling in the cold dawn breeze. Within those ancient walls, a queen-to-be knelt atop a threadbare prayer rug, her gaze lowered, lips moving in silent supplication, not for love, not for riches, but for release. She was Margaret of Anjou, barely 15, her bridal chamber prepared at the far end of this corridor, adorned with tapestries of saints and martyrs, a canopy bed draped in velvet as black as the dread that gnawed at her heart. The groom she would never truly know, the treaty that bound her life to the English crown, was sealed by her father's hand months ago. Now every breath she drew felt like ink spilled upon a contract she had never signed. Margaret had grown up among whispering corridors and half-lit chapels, the daughter of a fading French duke whose fortunes had waned with every passing harvest. From the moment monks had first schooled her in prayer and Latin at the tender age of 7, her destiny had been drawn in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. A bride, a vessel for alliance, a pawn on a chessboard too vast for her young mind to comprehend. But as the years tumbled past, the lofty hymns of convent choirs twisted into dirges for queens who vanished behind fortress gates, queens who dreamed of angels unburdened by crown or consort, praying that heavenly mercy would claim them before a mortal bridegroom ever laid claim to their bodies. Half a world away in the snow-swept kingdom of Castile, another princess knelt in a stone-walled oratory, her alabaster hands clasped so tightly the knuckles glowed white. Isabella of Portugal was 17, her skin still dewy with youth, her hair the color of midnight, plucked from a raven's wing. Yet her dreams belonged to specters, visions of cloisters where she might wander barefoot among figs and cypress trees, her vows exchanged not with a king, but with a silent god. Already, her marriage to Philip IV of Castile had been arranged to secure borders and bolster armies, a union celebrated by nobles and chronicled in gold-leaf annals. But Isabella's only prayer was for death in her sleep, a soft departure that would spare her the torment of waking each morning to gilded cages and a bed she could not refuse. Between these two princesses lay the narrow straits of the Mediterranean, the Alps' jagged spines, the endless forests of Lorraine and Burgundy. Yet their souls were joined by a dread as ancient as the throne itself. For in every court across Christendom, young women stood at the threshold of marriage with hearts clenched by a single terror, that their wedding nights would be not a union of affection, but an initiation into duties far darker than any battlefield. They prayed to die first, for death held promise of freedom, a final absolution from the merciless politics that sought to claim their bodies before their spirits were their own. Our story begins in the year of our Lord, 1325, on the eve of John of Bohemia's wedding to Elizabeth of Bohemia. The great hall of Prague Castle was lit with torches that threw grotesque shapes upon its vaulted ceiling, a forest of shadows that seemed to watch as Elizabeth, only 13, stepped forward in a gown of dove white embroidered with pearls. She had been raised in the silent halls of her mother's convent retreat, her laughter as rare as spring frost. Now, as she knelt before the altar, the candles sputtered in sympathy with her terror, for the man she would marry was a famed warrior nearly twice her age, whose campaigns against the Tatars were sung across Europe. He would expect an heir and a haven in her body, and Elizabeth's prayers were already fashioned into pleas for an end to this fate. "O Lord," she whispered, "take me to your bosom before I awaken as a queen." Her voice echoed on polished stone, reaching the cloister's hidden corners where her lady-in-waiting, a former nun named Marta, bent low with despair. Marta had seen too many noble brides reduced to trembling whispers, their cheeks hollowed by fear that blossomed like a plague within their breasts. She carried Elizabeth's final prayers to the chapel's altar, a small wooden cross carved by monks in Wiesenberg, where she lit a single taper and watched the flame dance up the carved angels. Marta dared not hope the prayer would be answered, To pray so was to risk the church's counsel, and perhaps to be branded with sin. Yet in her own heart she cleaved to the thought that death held mercy where life offered none. In England, too, the pall of dread hovered over Windsor Castle like a vulture. Philippa of Hainaut, born into prosperity yet shipped across the Channel as part of Edward III's grand strategy, lay on her pallet bed listening to the clash of armor in the courtyard below. Her husband, the king, a youth of 20, practiced his swordplay by dawn, the clang of steel a cruel metronome counting down Philippa's final moments of innocence. She recalled the lullabies her nurse had sung in her native tongue, lyrics of fields and wildflowers, but those memories felt distant as the moonlit moors of her homeland. Philippa knew that if the sword's ring did not end her fear, her wedding night surely would, and so she lifted her head, eyelids swollen from tears, and prayed for angels to bear her away before solemn vows were spoken and the bedchamber door closed behind her. These four princesses, Margaret and Isabella, Elizabeth and Philippa, shared the same silent covenant. They would rather lie cold and still beneath the earth than take part in rituals that bound them body and soul to men chosen by chancery and council. Their stories weave together the grim tapestry of medieval queenship, where the youngest brides carried rosaries not just in their fingers, but in their throats, choking back the cries of terror that threatened to spill forth at every courtly procession and bridal dinner. Yet in their prayers to die before marriage lies a deeper truth. The dread of what came after the wedding night was not merely fear of sex, but fear of erasure. These girls understood that marriage stripped them of names, of belongings, and most crushingly, of choice. A queen was no longer a daughter or a sister. She became property of the realm, her body a forge for heirs, her womb a battlefield for religious politics. The church, though it preached mercy, had sanctioned marriage as sacrament, and in doing so, lent divine mandate to the very transactions that pitted daughters against fathers, kingdoms against kingdoms. Even cloistered nuns sworn to a life of celibacy were not immune. They too could be plucked from their vows to serve as brides of state, their sacred oaths cast aside like ragged cloaks. To understand why queens prayed to die before marriage, we must descend into the labyrinth of medieval ritual. The betrothal feast where childhoods were traded for carpets and crowns, the courier's arrival bearing letters sealed with wax and papal permission, the procession to the altar, a gauntlet of banners and advisors who measured every move for signs of dissent. We must witness the dressing of the bride, her hair undone and braided with ribbons of gold, while gentle hands coaxed her into the virgin whites of matrimony. We must attend the wedding banquet where minstrels sang of Cupid's conquests, even as the bride's lips quivered with anxiety, and guests toasted to fertility as they watched the trembling of her fingers. And finally, we must stand outside the sealed door of the bridal chamber, as the silver key turns in the lock and the assembled witnesses retreat to the antechamber. Within lies darkness and dread, the bride, her heart pounding like prayer drums, the groom, his eyes flickering with expectation, and perhaps at the center of the bed, the silent blessing of the church, the white bridal sheet spread across crimson, velvet, a shroud in waiting. The witnesses would listen for the rustle of linen, the gasp of woman as she wept or cried out, and then proclaim the consummation, evidence of virginity deflated, of alliances sealed in blood and fear. In that moment, the queen's prayer to die before marriage was a confession of terror and a plea for grace. It was a desperate hope that heaven's gates might open before earth's chains closed around her wrists. It was the knowledge that to live as queen was to live without self, to become a cipher in annals penned by clerks who cared not for her laughter or tears. And so she offered up her soul, begging for release, even as her body was carried from the chapel into a life she had not chosen. This is the first chapter of our exploration into those shadowed vows and silent prayers. Over the next 2,000 words, we will follow Margaret of Anjou as she navigates the torchlit corridors of Blois and the whispering councils of Westminster. We will walk with Isabella of Portugal through cloistered gardens and grand banquet halls, where her hands tremble not for soup, but for the hope of oblivion. We will witness Elizabeth of Bohemia's quiet rebellion beneath the arms of stained-glass saints, and we will see Philippa of Hainaut's fragile courage bloom beneath Edward's stern gaze. In their stories, we will uncover the soul-shaking terror of medieval marriage, and why these young queens, poised on the brink of history, yearned for death rather than brideship. Here begins the true tale of why queens prayed to die before marriage, a chronicle of dread and devotion, of sacrifice and survival, that casts a stark light upon the gilded cages of power. The dawn mist curled like restless ghosts around the towers of Windsor Castle as Philippa of Hainaut was roused from her troubled slumber. Outside her high chamber, the clang of the great bell summoned her to the chapel, where the marriage vows would be solemnized before God in court. Long shadows stretched across the stone floor, stretching toward the high altar as Philippa knelt before the bishop. Her heart throbbed in her throat, each beat a drum of dread. Across the nave, Edward III stood tall and handsome, his armor gleaming dully in torchlight. He bore no mirror for her terror, only the weight of expectation. When their hands met in the shepherd's knot, Philippa felt her soul twist like the linen braid around their joined fingers, a gesture not of love, but of ownership. By the time the procession wound through the narrow corridors toward the great hall, Philippa's resolve had hardened into a single prayer, that the Blessed Virgin might intervene, stealing her breath before Edward's breath claimed her innocence. But the hall awaited her with banners snapping in a chill breeze, trumpets heralding her arrival, and noble women eager to greet their new queen. She took measured steps beneath a canopy of cloth dyed in the royal blue of England, aware of every rustle of the crowd, every murmur that trailed in her wake. Laughter rose like poisoned wine as the minstrels struck their harps, their melodies at odds with the dread pooling in Philippa's veins. Meanwhile, across the Alps in Prague, Elizabeth of Bohemia's first night as queen unfolded behind the sealed doors of her bridal chamber. The red glow of torches lit the chamber's tapestries, painting her pale face in living flame. John of Bohemia stood before her, clad in fine damask and chainmail, a sword at his hip and a crown perched precariously upon his brow. He offered her a goblet of spiced wine, the bouquet heady with cloves and cinnamon. Elizabeth's hand trembled as she accepted it, not in gratitude, but in terror of what lay beyond the ceremonial toast. She sipped, intending only to wash away her fear, but the wine burned in her throat like a vow turned to ash. In Castile, Isabella of Portugal faced her own trial. The Alcazar's great courtyard lay sun-drenched and silent as she walked barefoot upon flagstones still warm from the noon sun. Her gown of ivory silk whispered around her slender ankles, the hem embroidered with fleur-de-lis, the symbol of her native France, an emblem too heavy for her heart. She was led toward the Hall of Councils, where the Cortes waited to witness the consummation of her union with Philip IV. Yet as she passed beneath the stone archways carved with royal insignia, Isabella's palms slicked with sweat. She could almost hear the rustle of her subjects' thoughts, admiration for the alliance, pity for the child queen, but above it all rang the dirge of her own terror. She wanted to collapse, to sink into the stones and be swallowed by oblivion. Back in England, Philippa's wedding feast unfolded with sumptuous excess. Peacocks roasted whole, spice-laden pastries, goblets of Burgundy wine pressed to her lips by eager hands. Yet Philippa could taste only bitterness. Every noble woman's gaze measured her beauty in her youth. Every whisper wondered whether she would bear sons and daughters swiftly. When at last the feast yielded to the soft light of dusk and the torches were extinguished, save one beside the dais, Philippa was led by her handmaidens to the queen's privy chamber. There, the door was barred, and she stood alone in a room heavy with the scent of lavender and fear. A chamberlain handed her a simple shift of linen, the attire of innocence, and guided her toward the bed. It was draped in a white linen sheet bordered by crimson velvet, an altar for flesh and blood. Philippa's breath came in short, ragged sobs as she watched her maids remove her gown and loosen her braids. Each lock of hair that fell to the floor felt like a fragment of her identity, severed by the ritual. When at last she was left in nothing but the pale shift, Philippa's body shook with terror that no prayer could soothe. An hour later, beyond the chamber door, the chamberlain announced that the act was complete, and the door opened to reveal Philippa's trembling form. She was crowned Queen of England that very night, but her face bore the hollow look of one who had bargained her soul and found only silence in return. In Bohemia, Elizabeth's ordeal took a darker turn. John, determined to secure an heir, would brook no delay. The chamber's heavy curtains were drawn, and Elizabeth found herself alone with her husband and two stern-faced matrons appointed by the king. They hovered as she disrobed, murmuring instructions like surgeons guiding a knife. There was no ceremony of roses here, only the rustle of silk and the sigh of desperation as Elizabeth's naked form was arranged upon a bed the size of a bier. The matrons held lamps to cast light upon her body to ensure the witness of consummation. Elizabeth's head lolled back, her eyes half closed in prayer that death might come before dawn, that dawn might never arrive to greet her as queen. All the while in Castile, Isabella's trial loomed. The pious compound of the Alcazar, once a place of refuge, felt now like a tomb. Philip's confessor stood ready to certify her virginity, or lack thereof, while pages scurried, chambers cleared, and scholars awaited in the antechamber to record the proof. Isabella, quivering, rose and moved toward the bed that had been prepared in the private chamber of the Alcazar's keep. A carved oak frame hung with tapestries of saints who had known not joy, but martyrdom. There, she removed her gown, and with hands like ice, laid upon the sheet, expecting the hand of her husband, or the hand of God, to release her from life's boundless prison. As the hush of night settled over Europe's courts, each girl lay upon her bed, bodies intertwined with men she scarcely knew. The witnesses waited to proclaim the consummation, instruments at their side to record the signs of virginity spilled. In the blackest hours, Margaret of Anjou, now transported from Blois to Westminster, endured her own twilight. Her second chapter in England began with the ritual known as the bedding, where she and Henry VI were escorted by noble spectators to the royal chamber. The heavy cedar doors closed. Within, Margaret's trembling form met Henry's measured, almost clinical approach. There was no cruelty here, no tenderness, only the colliding of two futures bound by dynastic necessity. Margaret's candle guttered in its brass holder, casting her face into chiaroscuro. She closed her eyes, praying not for death but for forgetfulness, so that she might awake free of memory. But memory came swiftly, a searing imprint as the frankincense haze of the chapel gave way to the musk of mortal flesh. When morning came and Margaret emerged, her cheeks hollowed by sleeplessness, the chamberlain declared the rite fulfilled. Yet Margaret felt nailed to the world by that night's horrors, her maidenhood a spectre carved from anguish rather than pride. Across the channel, Isabella, now ensconced in the Alcazar's gilded halls, woke to find herself Queen of Castile. The linen sheet bore testimony to her compliance. The confessor's seal guaranteed her place in the annals. But Isabella's body ached with the pain of birth that had not yet come. The body realm of her womanhood shattered before it could bloom. She drifted through the corridors like a ghost, hands clutching the folds of her cloak, stopping only to murmur prayers for an end swift and merciful. In Prague, Elizabeth confronted the aftermath. The matrons withdrew, John of Bohemia donned his sword belt once more, and she was left alone in the half-light of her new dominion. Her body bore the silent witness of that night's events, the matron's marks upon her flesh, the tremor in her bones that no cradle could calm. She bowed her head in prayer, but her plea was the same as her predecessors, a refrain of penance and despair, a plea that death might claim her before the kingdom's cares consumed her soul. And so the second chapter closes on 4 crowned girls, each forever changed by the wedding night's brutal rite. They bore the crowns of Europe upon foreheads haunted by tragedy, their prayers for death unanswered, their lives surrendered to the machinery of power. Yet in that bleakness lies the seed of resistance, the memory of the self before the crown, the knowledge that a soul can endure even when the body is claimed. As Margaret, Isabella, Elizabeth, and Philippa stand at the threshold of queenship, their hearts beat with a fierce question: what price must be paid to wear a crown? And is there redemption beyond the bridal bed? In the coming pages, we will follow their steps through courts of intrigue and corridors of power, as they seek to reclaim the selves they once prayed to leave behind. And so, across the chilly stone corridors of Europe's grandest courts, behind embroidered veils and beneath gilded crowns, the queens who once were girls walked like shadows in their own lives. For them, the wedding was not the beginning of a love story. It was the end of freedom. Once married, a queen became property, a conduit, a living treaty between nations. Her body, sacred to her family, was now statecraft, and her womb, not her wisdom, was her greatest value. She could speak 10 languages, read Latin, play the harpsichord, and quote Cicero by heart. But if she did not bear sons, she was a failure. In the Habsburg court, young Isabella of Portugal, wed to Charles V, wrote letters back to her ladies in Lisbon that read more like prison notes. She was watched by strangers, even in her sleep. She could not eat unless others had tasted her food first. She could not even choose her own clothes. Court etiquette was so strict that even smiling too brightly was seen as a sign of disrespect to the empire, and the loneliness was unbearable. A queen could not have close friends. Not truly. Every servant, every lady in waiting, every noblewoman who brushed her hair or brought her books was reporting back to someone. Whispered secrets were dangerous. Trust was fatal. A wrong word could be twisted and used as poison. So the queen learned silence. She learned to nod without agreeing, smile without joy, endure without flinching. In France, Catherine de' Medici arrived as a girl of 14, married to the boy King Henry. She was laughed at for her foreign accent, her Italian ways, her inability to conceive. When she did not immediately produce heirs, the French court whispered she was barren. Henry's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, ruled the royal bed in courtly favor. Catherine was queen in title, but in practice invisible. And yet she endured, she waited, she observed, she learned to wield silence like a weapon. This was what queens were forced to do, learn to live in shadows. If they spoke too much, they were dangerous. If they wept, they were weak. If they resisted, they were mad. Some chose the convent, the lucky ones. A few noble families managed to secure a religious path for their daughters instead of marriage. To be a nun, cloistered behind walls, with books and gardens and silence, was, in some cases, the greatest escape. It meant no man would ever claim you. It meant your body was yours. You would never be forced to bear child after child until you died in bloody linen. You would never be traded like fine silk to a king you'd never met. But not every girl had that choice. And queens almost never did. Take poor Margaret of Denmark, wed to James III of Scotland at just 13. She arrived in a storm-battered land with no allies. She could not speak the language. Her letters to her mother back in Copenhagen became smaller and sadder, eventually stopping altogether. Her role? To calm a violent Scottish court, to tame a man twice her age who drank too much and trusted too little. She failed, of course. No girl could succeed, and when James's enemies rose against him, they came for her first, because a queen was a symbol. To burn a flag was nothing, to publicly humiliate a queen was war. In palaces across Europe, noble women whispered to their daughters before they married, "Do not speak first. Do not look your husband in the eye. Do not eat too much. And never, never show your fear." Fear was blood in the water, and the husbands, kings, dukes, emperors, were often little more than overgrown boys with too much power and too little empathy. They had been raised to believe women were tools. That marriage was conquest. That softness was sin. Some were gentle, kind even, but many were not. And if the queen resisted, if she said no, the marriage bed became a battlefield. For royal women, the word consent had no meaning. To deny the king was treason. A queen could be beaten, locked away, or declared mad simply for refusing the man she was married to. And if she bore a stillborn child, or her son died of fever, the blame fell on her. People whispered of witchcraft, curses, sin. In Tudor England, Anne Boleyn was accused of seducing the king with her devilish arts, and when she failed to give him a son, he had her executed. Her crime? Being a woman the king no longer wanted. Even queens who survived childbirth were not safe. Elizabeth of Valois, the Spanish Queen of France, died at 23 after several traumatic pregnancies. She was mourned as a gentle soul, but behind that praise was a quiet acknowledgement that she had fulfilled her role. She had tried to give France an heir. That was all history expected of her. The heartbreak of queens was written not in poems, but in ledgers, recorded in dowries and treaties. Their pain became history's footnote. But still, some women fought. Some whispered in the dark. Some wrote letters hidden behind secret codes. Some passed on warnings to the next generation. Some turned to religion, others to poison. A few even ruled, but the cost was always high. For every queen who outlived her husband and grasped power with shaking hands, there were dozens buried young, unnamed, forgotten. Their portraits still hang in castles, their faces calm, painted with roses in their cheeks, but behind those painted eyes were dreams of escape, silent screams, prayers not for happiness, but for death before marriage, because to die was often kinder than to be queen. And yet they walked down those wedding aisles, dressed in velvet and gold, holding bouquets made by trembling hands, smiling as their fathers kissed their foreheads and gave them away, to a man, to a throne, to a life they could never truly call their own. The silence of queens became the music of courts, but if you listen closely behind the harps and the flutes, you'll still hear the echo. Please, God, let me die before the wedding. Some queens lived long, too long. They outlasted their kings, their children, even their countries, but they did not rejoice in survival, because survival, for a queen, did not mean freedom. It meant watching everything crumble in slow motion. It meant wearing widows black and remembering how the cage first closed. They were called dowagers, ghosts in palaces they once ruled. Their power was ceremonial, their days filled with protocol, memorials, embroidery, and endless waiting for the world to forget them. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz lived into her 70s, far longer than most women of her era, but she buried 15 children. 15. Some died in infancy, others in painful, drawn-out illness. She kept a black shawl by her bedside and a lock of each child's hair in a carved box. The palace whispered that she wandered the corridors at night, calling names that no one dared to speak aloud. And even in death, queens were rarely free, buried in tombs beside men who had used them, sculpted in stone as submissive, serene, and silent. Their histories written by men, their names twisted, their legacies cut to fit the tastes of chroniclers who found ambition unfeminine and pain unworthy of record. Yet behind closed doors, some queens dared to tell the truth, in hidden diaries, in letters they knew would be burned, in secret warnings passed from sister to sister. They wrote of beds they were dragged into, of nights they bled alone, of children they were forced to give away, of love that never came. Some wrote prayers not of devotion, but of desperation. Lord, if you love me, wrote one unnamed princess of Naples, take me before the wedding night. Another, sent to the Polish court at 12, smuggled a scrap of a psalm inside her slipper. Deliver me from the hands of the mighty, from those who smile but seek to destroy. They were queens, but they were also girls who once ran through orchards barefoot, who dreamed of songs, not crowns, who read poetry by candlelight and imagined a future that belonged to them. And then the marriage contract arrived. It was always the same, a thick packet of parchment sealed with wax, signed by men who never asked her if she loved the groom, or even if she knew his name. It included lists of jewels, tapestries, dishes, and horses, instructions on dowries and territories, promises of obedience, but never, never a space for the girl to write her own name by choice. And so, the procession began. A ship or carriage, months of travel, foreign languages, strange foods, new gods, a crown that didn't fit, a bed that felt like an altar, and a husband who didn't see a person, only a promise. Yet somehow, some queens resisted in ways history barely records. Maria Theresa of Austria, though married young, clawed her way to real rule. She governed an empire, reformed law, built schools, and faced down the Prussian king. But she paid in blood. Her pregnancies were nearly constant. Her daughters bartered away, her body a political map. And still, she wrote, "The crown is heavier than any mother's sorrow, yet both are mine." Some queens faked illnesses to avoid their husbands. Some bribed midwives. Some took lovers in secret. But they all knew the cost if discovered. To be caught was to be declared hysterical. Locked away, your children taken, your name wiped from memory, because a rebellious queen was more dangerous than any army. A queen could inspire revolts without raising a sword. Her silence could freeze diplomacy. Her tears could move nations. So they were watched more closely than spies, dressed more extravagantly than courtesans, paraded like trophies, but imprisoned more tightly than criminals. Even Elizabeth the Fern of England, who famously never married, lived surrounded by fear. She knew from childhood what marriage had done to her mother. She knew the risks of trusting any man. And though she ruled alone. Her image was constructed, her virginity mythologized, but inside she was still a woman who had to sacrifice touch for power. She once said, "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart of a king." Yet it's not weakness that haunts her story, it's the aching absence of a life freely chosen. For most queens, even power was not enough. It was a shield, but never armor. They learned to navigate danger with grace, to smile while swallowing grief, to bless unions that shattered their hearts, to name sons after men who had hurt them, to dance at balls held in their honor while bleeding beneath their gowns. They were taught never to run, but they dreamed of it. Catherine Howard did run. A queen barely in her teens, married to Henry VIII, she risked it all for a shred of love. When caught, she screamed not for mercy, but for her mother. A child's cry echoing through the stone halls of Hampton Court. She was beheaded at 17. What she left behind was a whisper for the queens who would follow. Better to die than live like this. Even in modern times, the echoes continue. The ritual softened, the palace is air-conditioned, but the scrutiny remains. The cameras replaced the court, the tabloids became the new courtiers. And still, royal women are measured by their fertility, their fashion, their obedience. When Princess Diana cried on her wedding day, people said it was joy, but she later revealed it was dread. She knew what waited behind the gold and lace. She knew she would be watched, weighed, and judged forever. And so, from ancient thrones to velvet-lined limousines, the story is the same. A girl is chosen. A wedding is arranged, a smile is rehearsed, and somewhere deep within her a prayer is whispered, not for love, not even for peace, but simply, quietly, "Please, let it end before it begins." This is the truth history seldom tells, the soft tragedy beneath the royal pageant, the invisible cost of crowns. Because for centuries queens did not dream of glory, they dreamed of escape, and if the heavens would not deliver it, then perhaps death would. A prayer repeated across time, carved in silence, written in trembling ink, echoed in the chambers of the heart. Let me die before marriage, let me be spared. And history, cold and unfeeling, turned the page. But now, we look back. We remember their names. We read between the lines. We see the child beneath the crown, and we listen. We listen to the prayer that still haunts the past. It began, as many tales of power and suffering do, with silence. A silence so heavy it seemed woven into the bridal veil itself, delicate, white, and suffocating. Somewhere deep within the cold stones of a medieval castle, behind heavy oak doors and tapestries stitched with saints, a young girl sat trembling. She was not weeping, that was not allowed. Instead, her hands were folded as if in prayer, her eyes cast downward as if her very gaze might betray her. She was 15, maybe 16. No one kept track of birthdays for daughters unless it was time to marry them off. And now, the time had come. Not because she was ready, but because her father's lands had dwindled, and her virginity was the only coin left worth spending. For centuries, in palaces and hovels, in icy northern strongholds and golden southern courts, a girl's virginity was not her own. It was currency, it was inheritance, it was legitimacy. The blood on the wedding sheets, or lack thereof, could decide the future of kingdoms. And so, long before the wedding bells rang, she had already become an object in a larger game, a symbol, a seal of purity that must be unbroken until one man, and only one, had the right to ruin her. But what made virginity so powerful? Why did it matter more than the girl herself? To understand that, we must go far back, before the crowns, before the altars, to a time when bloodlines were the only proof of power. In a world without DNA tests or written contracts, legitimacy had to be visibly demonstrated, and nothing guaranteed legitimacy better than the belief that a bride had never known another man. Because if she hadn't, then the child she bore must belong to her husband, and that child could inherit without question lands, castles, thrones. And so virginity became less a matter of morality and more a mechanism of control. The bodies of women, especially noblewomen, were guarded like treasure vaults. Their chastity was patrolled by fathers, by brothers, by wet nurses and ladies' maids, by priests and confessors. Even their meals were sometimes controlled. lest certain foods heat the blood and awaken desires best left sleeping. The girl in the stone room understood none of this. She only knew that tomorrow she would be given away, and that everyone around her seemed more concerned about the state of a small piece of cloth than about the terror in her eyes. Her mother, once a bride herself, did not speak of her own wedding night. Instead, she pressed a dried sprig of rosemary into her daughter's palm, an old symbol of remembrance, and whispered that everything would be fine, so long as she was quiet and obedient. And she would try so very hard, because she knew what happened to girls who failed to prove their virtue. In the courts of Spain, noblewomen were inspected by midwives before marriage, their bodies examined, their hymens discussed in hushed but brutal detail. In the German principalities, bedsheets were displayed to relatives the morning after the wedding, held aloft like sacred relics. But not every girl bled, and not every girl was believed. One noblewoman, married off at 16 to a much older duke, failed to produce the expected stain. She had done nothing wrong. Her body had simply not reacted the way the world demanded. The whispers began immediately. Within weeks, she was sent to a convent for spiritual cleansing. The marriage was annulled. Her name was erased from the family history. This was the brutal calculus. The body of a bride had to tell a story that no one had any right to ask of it, and if it failed to speak in blood, it was punished. But it was not only nobles who suffered. In village life, the pressure was just as fierce, if less ceremonial. A peasant girl found pregnant before marriage might be dragged through the streets, her belly painted red as a mark of shame. A young wife who failed to prove her chastity could find herself cast out, her dowry confiscated, her children later denied the father's name. And for women in Islamic courts, the stakes were just as high, but the rituals were different. In some places, female slaves destined for a caliph's bed were subjected to hymen tests by court eunuchs. If they failed, even due to something as simple as horseback riding, they could be discarded or sold off as damaged goods. In this world, virginity was not innocence, it was value, a stamp of quality, like the unbroken seal on a jar of precious oil. And yet, men were never asked to prove the same. A boy could arrive on his wedding day reeking of wine and brothel smoke, and no one would care. He was expected to have known other women. In fact, experience was encouraged, proof of virility, of manhood. A virgin man was seen as unprepared, laughable even. But a girl, no matter how young, was expected to be untouched, unspoiled, unread by any eyes but her husband's. The injustice was so deep, it had become invisible. Our young bride, the one in the cold room with the rosemary in her hand, was about to be married to a man twice her age, a warlord with scarred hands and yellowed teeth. He had once killed a stable boy for looking at him the wrong way. He had already buried 2 wives. The first died in childbirth, the second fell down a staircase. Or so the story went. None of this mattered. He had offered 50 head of cattle, 2 trunks of silver, and the promise of an alliance. Her virginity would seal the deal. Her silence would keep it sealed. And so, as dusk fell and the candles were lit in the great hall below, the girl rose to meet her fate. Her veil was fastened, her shoes buckled, her cheeks painted the color of blood. She would walk down the aisle like a lamb to the altar, smiling because she must. And if she prayed that night, and she would, it would not be for joy or for love. It would be for mercy, because in a world where virginity mattered more than the bride herself, there was no room for doubt, no space for fear, no tenderness spared for the girl beneath the gown. Only obedience, only silence, and the hope that, come morning, the sheets would save her. Morning came not with joy, but with inspection. The sheets had been stained. The old women tasked with retrieving them nodded with solemn approval. The housekeeper brought them to the bride's mother with the reverence one might give a sacred relic. The stain was small, no more than a coin in size, but it was enough to quiet suspicion, enough to confirm what everyone had long hoped to see, that the bride had been untouched before this night. And yet, beneath her lace veil and modest smile, the girl lay still in the marriage bed, her body bruised and her spirit fractured. There had been pain, far more than she expected, and fear, a kind that no prayer could soothe. She had done what she was told. She had let it happen, like her mother warned. That was the role of a wife, to endure without question. And in this world, Survival often meant pretending, but this wasn't just her burden. It was an entire culture built on the unrelenting obsession with female purity, one that had seeped into every continent, every faith, every class. In Renaissance Italy, a father's reputation rose or fell on the chastity of his daughters. A girl who lost her virginity before marriage was said to carry a broken jewel, one that no honest man would ever wear. Some women went to extremes to protect the illusion. There were herbal remedies and potions to fake the signs of bleeding, pieces of sponge soaked in red dye, carefully pricked fingertips pressed onto cloth, even animal blood smuggled beneath nightgowns. Why such deception? Because punishment was certain. In cities like Florence or Seville, a dishonored girl might be sent to a convent, not for spiritual salvation, but as social exile. In the Ottoman Empire, young harem girls were often subjected to brutal checks for virginity, their futures depending entirely on their ability to pass. Those who failed were often cast out to the brothels, or worse, sold off at auction. The truth no one dared to say aloud was simple. Virginity was rarely about the woman. It was about everyone around her. The father, who could only secure a good match for his daughter if her purity was intact. The husband, who could only be sure his heirs were his own. The church, which declared that the female body was sacred only when untouched, and the community, which used a woman's chastity to measure a family's honor. Girls were told that their bodies were like glass, once cracked, never whole again. Their innocence was their identity, and once it was gone, there was no redemption. No one asked them what they wanted. No one asked whether they understood what was expected of them. They were simply warned. At 7 years old, don't let any man touch you. At 10, don't run with boys or let them look under your skirts. At 12, sit with your knees closed. At 14, your honor is in your hands, protect it. And by 15 or 16, their virginity had become something they guarded with fear, not because they understood it, but because they knew their lives depended on it. There was no protection from this, not even for queens. In Tudor England, Anne Boleyn was branded a whore not just for her betrayal of Henry VIII, but because of whispers that she hadn't come to the king's bed a virgin. Whether the rumors were true didn't matter. Perception was reality. Her enemies didn't need evidence. Her failure to fit the ideal of untouched maidenhood made it easier to destroy her. Even centuries later, the obsession hadn't faded. In 19th century France, a bride's wedding dress was white, not for fashion, but to signal purity. A woman who wore any other color risked being whispered about. Why not white? What is she hiding? The same happened in Russia. Girls of noble families were examined by elderly court women before entering marriage. Some were even required to wear symbolic belts, chastity belts in appearance if not in function, to reassure the groom's family of their untouched status. But the cruelest irony was this: many of these rituals were enforced not by men, but by other women, mothers, aunts, grandmothers, maids, women who had once been young brides themselves, and who now passed down the same fear they had been taught to carry. They whispered warnings, stitched secrets into corsets, taught daughters how to survive in a world that worshipped purity but punished curiosity. And when things went wrong, when a girl was assaulted, or when her body didn't behave the way it was expected to, these same women often turned away, not out of cruelty, but survival. To question the system meant questioning everything. And so, the cycle endured. The young bride in our story returned to daily life. Her marriage had been consummated, and so she was now officially a wife. A status more respected than daughter, but no less trapped. Her virginity was gone, but its power lingered. People treated her with more deference now. She was respectable, acceptable, but she knew the truth. Her value had not increased. It had merely been transferred from her father to her husband. She was no longer an object to be protected. She was now one to be owned. And still, she could not speak of that night, could not say how she had trembled when the door closed, could not describe the weight of a man twice her age pressing down upon her like a stone slab. There was no room for confession, only a performance to maintain, a script she hadn't written, but was forced to follow. And if she were to die young, in childbirth perhaps, as many did, people would speak kindly of her. They would say she was modest and chaste, that she fulfilled her duties. Her tombstone might read faithful wife or virtuous daughter, but never free, because freedom had never been hers to begin with. It belonged to the men who measured her worth in blood, to the matrons who guarded her like a locked chest, to the society that saw her not as a person, but as a symbol. And that symbol, the untouched girl, the pure bride, would haunt generations to come. The girl wasn't born to be a bride. She was born to be a child, curious, barefoot, with wild hair and questions about the world. But from the moment her body began to change, she became a project, a future investment, a creature to be shaped, hidden, and prepared. Every lesson she received came with a warning. Every compliment was a test. "Such a quiet girl," they said. "That was good. Such a modest walk. Even better. She never looks men in the eyes. Perfect." But behind those eyes there was always fear, not of doing wrong, but of being caught, because virginity wasn't a thing you could see. It wasn't a jewel or a veil. It was a story others told about you, and it could be taken away in a whisper. All it took was a rumor. In 17th century Spain, a girl named Lucia was accused of lifting her skirt for a stable boy. There was no proof, no witness, just an angry sister who disliked her. But once spoken, the words could not be taken back. Lucia was sent away, not to prison, but to silence. Her family moved her to a distant cousin's estate. Her engagement was cancelled. She never married. No man would take a girl who had been talked about. In medieval France, noble families sometimes hired midwives to inspect the daughters of rival households. If they could prove a girl was not a virgin, her political value plummeted, land deals vanished, alliances collapsed. A girl's body, still untouched by choice or chance, could be ruined by a single accusation. Even in cultures where virginity wasn't a sacred rule, it was still a dangerous myth. Among the Mongol nobility, young brides were expected to remain pure until marriage. But what defined pure was rarely clear. Some rituals required blood to be shown. Others relied on the husband's word alone. If he declared his bride unworthy, she might be returned like defective livestock. Her father, shamed. Her name, cursed. It didn't matter that bodies didn't always bleed. It didn't matter that fear could tighten muscles, or that years of riding horses or playing outdoors could stretch what others believed should remain closed. Science had no place in superstition. Even in the most sacred temples, the same story played out. In ancient India, Devadasis, girls given to serve in temples, were required to remain pure until ritual deflowering, but many were violated in secret long before the official ceremonies. If they resisted, they were beaten. If they told, they were blamed. The purity was never for them. It was for the gods, for the patrons, for the men who paid to watch innocence disappear. And so, the myth grew. That virginity could be seen in the way a girl walked, that it could be heard in her voice, high and soft, that it could be measured by blood or posture or the way she lowered her gaze. It became a ritual of control, passed down through generations like a sacred inheritance. In 19th century Japan, geisha girls were trained to perform the illusion of untouched youth. Their clients knew better, but the act, the illusion of innocence, was part of the appeal. In a world where men held power, nothing thrilled more than the performance of submission. Even in the West, where love was beginning to slip into the language of marriage, virginity still reigned. A woman who had given herself to another man before marriage, even if it was willingly, even if she had loved him, was often labeled as damaged goods. Her emotions did not matter. Her heart was not what the world cared about, only the fact that she had once belonged to someone else. Even royalty was not immune. When Princess Catherine of Aragon arrived in England to marry Prince Arthur, her virginity was the subject of international negotiation. After Arthur's death and her later marriage to his brother Henry VIII, the question of whether she had consummated her first marriage became the legal core of an entire kingdom's religious split. If she was a virgin, Henry had married her lawfully. If not, their union was invalid. Her womb became a battlefield. Centuries later, little had changed. In 20th century Albania, the Kanun Code still dictated that a woman must remain a virgin until marriage or risk being killed by her own family. The bride's family might even hang a bloody bedsheet from the window after the wedding night as proof, and if there was no blood, they might fake it to survive. These rituals crossed borders, languages, empires. What differed was not the myth, but the methods. And always, behind the rituals, was fear. Because virginity wasn't just about honor, it was about power. A virgin bride was easier to control. She had no past to compare, no former lovers to recall. She entered her new life with no frame of reference, no memories but what her husband would now give her. She was a blank page, and men loved to write. In rural France, there were entire professions built around this myth. Women who taught young girls how to act innocent, even if they weren't. They practiced feigned pain, shy glances, even the right way to cry without ruining their face. In upper-class brothels of 18th century Paris, some girls were trained to mimic the loss of virginity again and again, because men paid more for the first time, even if it was a lie. But not all women submitted. Some played the system. In Ottoman harems, women often had sexual agency long before they reached the sultan's bed. They learned how to hide signs, how to deceive the eunuchs, how to manipulate their own narratives. The smartest concubines were not the most beautiful, but the ones who knew how to pretend. Because pretending in a world like this was survival. And what of the men? They could sleep with as many women as they pleased, before and after marriage. Their value did not lie in chastity, it lay in conquest. A man with experience was admired, a woman with the same was condemned, and yet both entered marriage, one with a history, the other with shame. The hypocrisy echoed louder with every generation, yet no one dared to name it, because to question the myth meant tearing down the entire stage. And for most families, that was too terrifying to imagine. The virgin bride remained the ideal, and girls learned quietly to become actresses. In the cold hush of dawn, she sat before the mirror, her hands folded in her lap. The white dress hung from her shoulders like a confession. Around her, the room breathed slowly. Heavy curtains, still air, faint perfume from the night before. Her face was calm, but her heart was not, because this was the morning after. The test had been passed, the stain had been shown. The witnesses, mother, aunt, midwife had seen the proof, blood on linen, her honor preserved. The bride untouched before last night was now a wife, a woman. But she did not feel changed, she felt erased. Her worth, so long guarded, had been spent. She had been a treasure, a symbol, a prize. And now she was ordinary, used, not unwanted, no, not yet, but no longer divine. Her virginity had been currency. Now that it was paid, what was she? It was a question many women never dared to ask, because from childhood they had been taught to protect, preserve, obey. They were vessels, gates, offerings. Their value was external. Their body, a document others read for meaning. In 16th century Italy, dowries were carefully calculated based on a girl's virginity. A chaste girl from a poor family could sometimes fetch a better marriage than a wealthy girl with even the hint of scandal. If there was suspicion, even if false, the price dropped. Families lost fortunes, brothers lost political alliances, fathers lost face. A girl's body was not her own, it was a ledger. Even in quiet villages of Scandinavia, far from royal courts, a bride was expected to prove herself on the wedding night. Women who didn't bleed were sent back in disgrace. It didn't matter if the bride had simply been born differently. The myth was stronger than biology. And when biology failed, theater took its place. A bride in 19th century Egypt might secretly cut her own thigh before lying with her husband. A small stain on the sheet was enough. In parts of Eastern Europe, mothers provided pig's blood, discreetly smeared at dawn. Entire communities depended on this illusion. The sheet was everything, because honor was public. But shame? Shame lived in silence. In Ethiopia, young girls in the countryside whispered warnings to one another about how to behave, how to fake pain, how to weep believably. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, noble women learned to write poetry and play the gyeogam, but their most important education was silence. A virgin did not speak of desire. Desire made her dangerous, and still desire bloomed, because girls are human. Because even in cages, the heart wanders. There were brides who loved, who kissed behind closed doors, who risked everything for a moment of closeness. And if they were caught, the punishment was swift. In Renaissance England, a noblewoman named Anne was found to be pregnant before marriage. Her lover was executed. She was sent to a convent for life. Her child, if born, was cast out, not just illegitimate, but cursed, all because she had loved too soon. The myth of virginity was never about purity. It was about timing. If a woman gave herself to a man before the contract, she was a disgrace. If she gave herself after, she was a wife. Same body, same act, different meaning. In imperial China, concubines were often selected for their virginity, not because the emperor cared, he had dozens of women, but because each untouched girl symbolized a gift from the provinces, a new alliance, a fresh start. Once taken, she was marked. She could rise if she pleased him, or disappear if she didn't. And if she lied, if a concubine faked her virginity or bribed a eunuch to pass inspection, she risked death. But some did, because a fake future was better than no future at all. The performance was everything. And so, across cultures, centuries, and empires, the same shadow lingered. Virginity was never just about the woman. It was about what others could do with her, trade her, control her, claim her, and once claimed, move on. Even today, echoes remain. In some parts of the world, hymenoplasty, surgical reconstruction of the hymen, is a booming industry, not for health, but for perception. Women pay to be believed, to be seen as worthy. To erase a past others never had the right to judge. Virginity certificates are still issued. Honor killings still occur. Rape victims are still blamed for losing value. Because even now, for some, a woman's first sexual experience is not hers to own. It is something taken, measured, judged. But things change. Slowly, painfully, they change. Voices rise. Women speak. Scholars challenge the myth. Doctors educate. Artists reclaim. And girls, little by little, begin to understand. Their worth does not live between their legs. It lives in their mind, their laughter, their choices, their freedom. In a quiet house somewhere, not a palace, not a slum, just a house, a young girl asks her mother why people care so much about virginity. The mother sighs, looks out the window, and says softly, because they were afraid of women who knew themselves. The girl nods and does not look away. She will be no one's prize. She will write her own worth, and maybe one day the world will follow. They called it the happiest day of a woman's life, but behind every flower petal scattered on the stone floors of the medieval chapel, behind every smile carved into painted lips, behind the veil that trembled softly in the breeze, there was fear, not nervous excitement, not simple uncertainty, but a deep, cold, quiet terror, the kind of fear that settles not in the stomach, but in the bones. A fear so old and practiced it never dared to speak aloud. For the brides of history, the veil was never just decoration. It was a mask, a shield, a prison, woven from silk, but heavier than iron. Draped delicately over heads bowed in submission, it hid not only the face, but the truth. And that truth, hidden for centuries, was this. For many women, marriage was not an entrance into love, but a descent into something much darker. And on that descent, the bridal veil became both shroud and silence. In cold stone castles, in quiet villages, in golden courts and wooden huts, weddings took place like rituals. Dresses were prepared, dowries counted, hymns sung, but no one spoke of the night that followed. No one warned the girl, barely past childhood, what truly awaited her once the doors of the bedchamber closed. Some brides did not even know their husband's face before the day of their marriage. Royal daughters, noble cousins, peasant girls alike were bartered like livestock. One powerful family appeased another. A king cemented an alliance. A father rid himself of a burden. But always, it was the girl who paid the cost. She might be 14 or 12, sometimes younger. She stood at the altar trembling not because of love, but because her body was about to become someone else's property. Her name might be recorded in some ledger, her dowry measured in silver, her virginity sworn to by witnesses. But her voice? That didn't matter. The veil kept her quiet. In the high courts of Europe, the rituals were crueler than the fairy tales would ever admit. The bride was examined, physically, publicly, humiliatingly. Her virtue was a currency, and everyone wanted proof. Servants would check the bed sheets the morning after. A stain of blood was worth more than a chest full of gold. No blood meant shame, suspicion, sometimes annulment, sometimes death. In Tudor England, noble brides were often surrounded by older women on the wedding night, not to guide them, but to bear witness. They watched as the marriage was consummated, lurking just beyond the curtain. They listened for signs, the moan, the cry, the gasp, confirmation, or lack thereof. The bride was not a person, she was a performance. For peasant girls, the horror was simpler, but no less brutal. A farmer's daughter might be promised to a man 3 times her age. Her father received a cow. Her mother wept in silence. She walked to the church in her one good dress, hands shaking, breath shallow. Her groom smelled of ale and sweat. He smiled with broken teeth. That night there would be no kindness, no patience, only obligation. In some regions, the bridal veil was lifted not by the groom, but by his family. A symbolic gesture, they said, but it was a test, a way to inspect the bride like a merchant inspecting a mule. Was she pretty enough, strong enough, obedient enough? Sometimes the verdict came too late. In 16th century Italy, a noblewoman named Isabetta was married off to a lord she had never met. On her wedding night, he pulled back the veil and stared, then turned to his steward and said, "Send her back." She was returned to her father's house in disgrace. No one asked if she wanted to stay married. No one asked if she was hurt. No one asked if she was hungry. They only asked, "Why weren't you enough?" And for those who stayed married, the veil didn't come off so easily. It remained invisible but present long after the wedding day ended. It hung between husband and wife, between freedom and duty. The bride became a wife. The wife became a mother. The mother became invisible. She was expected to smile, to serve, to bear children, sons if possible. She was expected to never complain, never resist, never speak of what was done to her behind closed doors. If she cried, she was dramatic. If she bled, she was weak. If she died in childbirth, she had fulfilled her duty. The horrors behind the bridal veil were not always bloody. They were not always loud, most were quiet. A slow suffocation of identity, a theft of choice, a lifetime of silences swallowed like stones. And yet, the veil fluttered on as if nothing was wrong, as if all was pure and good and sacred. But some women saw through it. In a French convent in the 14th century, a girl named Marie refused to marry the man chosen for her. She escaped in the night, dressed as a novice nun, and fled into the woods. For months she hid among shepherds and beggars, until the man who had claimed her finally gave up. When she returned to the world, she refused to wear white again. She refused to be veiled. Others resisted in smaller ways. A whispered prayer before the ceremony, not for happiness, but for death. A look exchanged with a sister, a cousin, a mother who knew. A trembling hand clutching a charm under the lace. These were their rebellions. And yet the weddings continued. Lavish celebrations in golden halls. Bells ringing across hillsides. Dances that lasted till dawn. No one saw the girl behind the veil, or if they did, they didn't look long. No one saw her hands trembling. No one heard her quiet plea, "Please, let me survive this." Even queens weren't spared. Catherine de' Medici, powerful and feared, wept before her marriage. Anne of Cleves was mocked for her appearance, humiliated by the king who rejected her. Princesses were sent across oceans to marry men they'd never seen. And when they stepped onto foreign soil, they were stripped of their names, their languages, their identities. All that mattered was the veil, the image, the illusion, and behind it, the horror continued. She woke up with the weight of a name that wasn't hers. It had been spoken aloud in the church, sealed in vows, carved into silver goblets and etched onto the family crest. But it was never hers by choice. It was handed to her like a brand, a label burned into her skin. From that moment on, she belonged, not to herself, but to a man, to a lineage, to a household. Her old name, her true name, became a ghost. And the veil she had worn? It was folded and hidden away, placed in a wooden chest along with the gloves, the garter, and the faint smell of rosewater. But even without fabric over her face, she remained unseen. The wedding had taken her voice, her freedom, and now it asked for her obedience. In many cultures, the first morning after the wedding wasn't filled with warmth or intimacy, it was filled with inspection. Mothers-in-law stormed into chambers like inquisitors. Maids held up soiled linens for the elders to see. There were whispers if the sheets were too clean. There were curses if the bride had cried too loudly. There were questions, always questions, but never for the bride. Had he done it properly? Was she truly untouched? Did she resist? Would she be fertile? These were the questions that mattered. The girl herself? She was somewhere far away, curled beneath furs, her body sore, her eyes open and unblinking. It was done now. She was a wife. Her childhood had ended with the lifting of the veil, and there would be no returning to what once was. In medieval France, there was a ritual known as la relève du voile, the lifting of the veil. A symbolic gesture, yes, but it was often accompanied by something else, the lifting of expectations. The bride was now expected to serve, to produce, to behave, to smile at her husband's cruelty, to remain silent through his infidelities, to kneel when he entered the room, and to never raise her eyes too long. Some brides were locked away for days after their wedding, or resting in their chambers, visited only by old women bearing broth and herbs meant to soften the womb. Others were paraded through streets, hand in hand with husbands who drank too much and laughed too loudly. These women wore jewelry, fine silk, crowns of orange blossoms, but their eyes rarely glittered. In the Ottoman Empire, royal brides were chosen not for love, but for politics. Their wedding veils were embroidered with gold thread, but behind the shimmer was anxiety. If she bore a son, she would rise. If she did not, if she miscarried or gave birth to a daughter, she would be discarded like a used veil, hidden in a corner of the palace with the others. One such bride, Fatma Hatun, was married to a high-ranking vizier at the age of 13. Her wedding was a spectacle, filled with music, sweets, and incense that clung to the skin for days. But when the doors of the bridal chamber shut, the man who had smiled before the crowd turned quiet and cold. He removed her veil with the tip of his dagger, not gently, not carefully, and she learned then what marriage truly was. In Ming Dynasty China, the wedding veil was bright red, a symbol of joy and fortune, but beneath it, the bride often wept. She had spent her entire life preparing to become someone's wife. She had learned to cook, to walk with small steps, to speak softly. Her body had been wrapped in stiff silk, her feet bound until they broke, and on her wedding day, she was carried away in a palanquin, not even allowed to look back at her mother's face. She arrived at a strange house, greeted by strange voices. The veil stayed on until night. When it was finally lifted, she saw the face of her husband for the first time. He smelled of wine. He said nothing. She bowed. He nodded, and the door closed, and in the centuries that followed, the veil transformed again. In Victorian England, it became an icon of purity, a white veil, a white dress, a white smile. It was marketed in magazines, painted in portraits, sewn in ivory lace. It whispered of virtue, of elegance, of delicate fragility. But beneath the white, the same old shadows remained. Brides were still sold, now more subtly under the guise of propriety and romance, a good match, a favorable union. Her father nodded. Her mother cried softly. The girl walked down the aisle, trained not to trip, not to frown, not to speak above a whisper. The man waiting for her was twice her age. He owned land, horses, accounts in London. She owned nothing, not even her body. Once married, she couldn't sign contracts. She couldn't vote. She couldn't say no. If he forced himself on her, the law called it his right. If she fled, she was hunted. If she spoke out, she was called hysterical. The veil had become thinner, but it still muffled the truth. Even among the nobility, the horrors continued. Princess Caroline of Brunswick was married to George, Prince of Wales, against her will. He found her repulsive. She found him drunk and dull. They separated almost immediately, but the world never let her forget her failure to please. She was mocked, dragged through courts and pamphlets. Her veil became a shroud of scandal. And yet, she wore it again when forced to return to court, because a royal woman could never be fully free. And what of the women who refused? They were called unnatural, dangerous, witches, spinsters. Their refusal to marry was seen as a rebellion against the divine order. Some were locked in convents, others were starved of inheritance. A few were accused of crimes they never committed. anything to silence the woman who dared to live without a veil. In some cases, the horror turned grotesque. In 18th century Hungary, a bride named Alona was forced to marry a man who had already buried 2 wives. On their wedding night, he chained her to the bed. For weeks she was not seen. When a servant finally broke into the chamber, Alona was barely breathing. She lived, but never spoke again. They say she wandered the halls for years, still wearing her veil, long after her husband died, and still the ceremonies continued. Still the cakes were cut, the flowers arranged, the dances danced. Still the veils were lowered, trembling before the eyes of girls who knew nothing of what was coming. Their smiles were painted, their innocence paraded, but behind their eyes, fear, always fear. Not every marriage was cruel, not every husband a monster, but in the systems that shaped these unions, the woman rarely held power, and where there is no power, there is no safety. The veil did not protect her, it silenced her. It watched as she was taken, examined, bruised, used. It witnessed everything and told no one. There was a tradition in some parts of rural Europe, quiet, old, almost forgotten now, where a bride would sit alone in a dark room the night before her wedding. No candles, no mirrors, only silence. It was called the Night of the Veil. She was to reflect, to pray, to rid herself of childish dreams and prepare to become a wife. But in truth, it was a ritual of surrender. She sat in the dark, waiting for the morning, knowing that everything would change once the veil touched her face. Her life was no longer hers. It belonged to the name she would take, the children she would bear, and the man who would decide how loudly she could laugh. The veil was not just fabric, it was law, it was religion, it was obedience sewn in silk. In 15th century Italy, noble brides often wore veils so long that they trailed for yards behind them, carried by child servants and embroidered with family crests. It was a performance of purity, yes, but also of wealth and ownership. A woman under such a veil could barely move. She was ornamental, fragile, and utterly at the mercy of her husband's will. Some veils had bells attached to them, to alert people of the bride's approach, as if warning others that a new possession was being escorted to its master. In Bengal, during the Mughal period, elite brides were transported to their husband's home in enclosed palanquins, veiled from every angle. Even the sun was denied her. When she arrived, she was forbidden to step outside alone for the rest of her life. Her world shrank to walls and whispers, to embroidery, prayers, and childbirth, to waiting for news, waiting for visitors, waiting for him. The horror was not always in the wedding night, or even the man. Sometimes it was the slow decay of identity, the realization over weeks and months that the girl she had once been, curious, spirited, dreaming, was slipping away. No one asked what she wanted. No one asked what she feared. She could not even write a letter home without her husband's permission. She could not leave the house without being covered again. She could not stop the pregnancies or the pain or the long nights in which her body became unfamiliar to her. In the Russian Empire, brides in some Orthodox communities underwent a ceremonial cleansing, a bath meant to purify them before the veil. But the truth was, they were not preparing her for holiness, they were preparing her for submission. In one preserved folk song from the region, a bride sings quietly to herself as she is being dressed. My veil is not white, it is ash. My groom is not kind, he is fire. My mother is far, and my father does not hear. It is not a love song, it is a farewell. But of course, the world wanted to believe otherwise. Artists painted bridal veils like halos. Poets compared them to clouds. Merchants sold them in ivory boxes and whispered of the happiest day of her life. The myth of the joyful bride was repeated so often it became dangerous. Because if a woman cried on her wedding day, she was warned it would bring bad luck. If she resisted, she was told she was ungrateful. If she ran, she was hunted. In parts of West Africa during the 19th century, colonial influence introduced Victorian-style weddings to native communities. Alongside traditional rituals, girls were made to wear white veils, to cover their faces, to look down as they were married off to older men. The veil, once foreign, became another tool of silence. It was always the same silence, no matter the continent. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, a bride wore a thick, padded wedding robe, with a veil that covered her entire head and neck. She could not see, she could not speak. She was led by the hand, like a blindfolded child. and when she arrived at her new home, she bowed 3 times, touched her forehead to the ground, and was locked inside the bridal chamber. She had been taught this was honor. She had been told this was love. But when the door shut and she was left alone with a man she had never met, she learned the truth. Many did, and yet they bore it. They carried the weight of the veil long after it was lifted, through morning sickness and miscarriages, through winters of loneliness, through years of pretending to smile when guests asked, "Are you happy?" The veil had become invisible, but it was still there, tight around the throat, soft around the eyes, whispering, "Be good, be quiet, be less." Not every bride accepted it. Some rebelled, quietly or not at all. There was a woman in 19th century Spain who, after years of being beaten, sewed her wedding veil into a pillow. When she finally escaped, she left the pillow on the bed. Her husband woke alone, the fabric pressed against his face. She was never found, but the women in the village spoke of her in hushed tones, like a ghost or a saint. There was another in early America who married a wealthy merchant. On their wedding night, he ordered her to kneel. She refused. He struck her. She stood, walked calmly to the hearth, and threw her veil into the fire. That was the end of it. She returned to her father's house, veilless, husbandless, shamed, but free. Such women were rare, often punished, but they existed, and their stories flickered like candlelight behind the myths of pearls and petals, because for most escape was not an option, and so they endured. They endured the visits from in-laws who examined their wombs with superstition. They endured the prayers to gods they no longer believed in. They endured the loneliness of a bed they never chose, and through it all, the veil remained, in stories, in songs, in rituals repeated for generations. A girl too young, too scared, a ceremony too grand, too cruel, a chamber too dark, a silence too deep, and when she spoke of it later, if she ever did, it was not with words, but with eyes. The kind of eyes that had seen what the veil was really hiding. Not beauty, not grace, but horror. The quiet kind. The kind that begins with lace and ends with a locked door. There was a time when a woman could vanish the moment she became a bride. She could walk down the aisle, pass beneath an arch of flowers, and step into a silence that would never let her speak freely again. She would disappear behind layers of custom, of obedience, of motherhood, and no one would question it. Her name might remain, but the girl she had once been, the thoughts she once dared think, were swallowed by the veil. Some veils were never removed. In 17th century France, certain noble brides were required to keep their faces covered for days after the wedding, seen only by their husbands and midwives. It was said to preserve modesty. But behind closed doors, many of these brides were no more than breeding vessels, their comfort irrelevant, their consent assumed. The horror here wasn't always brutal. It was quiet, legal, sacred. The church often reinforced it. Priests blessed the veil. Sermons praised the obedient wife. Confessors reminded trembling young women that marriage was their divine duty, and to question it was to offend God. So even the victims could not be certain they were victims. Pain, after all, was part of being a woman. To weep was not resistance, it was expected. In Catholic Spain, brides were sometimes given a mantilla, a lace veil passed from mother to daughter. It was meant to be sacred, but in many households it also carried a different kind of legacy. The silent tears of women who never spoke of their wedding nights, who bore bruises beneath silk, who birthed child after child while their husbands prayed at altars of power and land. This wasn't marriage. It was entrapment, dressed in white, and when a bride died young, and many did, her veil became her shroud. In countless village cemeteries across Europe and Asia, archaeologists have found remains of women buried with their bridal veils still draped over their skulls. Some were only 15 or 16 years old. Some were already mothers. Some were still pregnant when the earth took them. No one speaks of this in wedding speeches. No one raises a glass to the girl who died in childbirth because her pelvis hadn't finished growing. No one sings for the bride who took her own life before the wedding night. But their stories live on, in the margins of letters, in folk songs barely remembered, in the cautious silences between generations. Sometimes the horror wore fine clothes. In the Ottoman Empire, the sultans married their brides with veils of priceless gauze and gold thread. But Beneath those jewels, many of the women were concubines, taken as tribute, enslaved from conquered lands, renamed, reclothed, and told they were lucky to be chosen. Their wedding veils were not symbols of celebration, they were gags. They could not speak their language, they could not return home, they could not say no. One of them, a Circassian girl, tried to flee. She was caught, punished, and wed in silence. Her veil was so heavy with embroidery that she fainted before the ceremony ended. The guards carried her out. The court poet wrote a sonnet about her beauty. No one recorded her name. Elsewhere, horror came not just from men, but from women too. Mothers who had once been veiled themselves now pressed the same veil onto their daughters. They whispered, "It's just how it is." They helped tie the corset, pin the hair, lower the fabric over the face, and inside them they buried their own memories, the shame, the blood, the pain, so deeply they could pretend this was love. Generations passed like that. Brides became mothers. Mothers made new brides. The veil passed on, untouched, unchallenged, until cracks began to show. In 19th century England, a woman named Caroline refused to wear the veil at her wedding. Her fiancé was furious. Her father called her hysterical, but she stood still, unveiled, and said, "If he wants me, he'll look me in the eyes." She was labeled difficult, but she was not the last. By the early 20th century, more women began to push back, not all at once, not everywhere, but quietly. A bride in Poland wore a blue ribbon instead of a veil. A bride in Syria insisted on walking to her wedding alone, her face uncovered. A bride in India shaved her head after marriage, not for tradition, but in protest, so her husband wouldn't touch her without listening first. Each act was small, but they mattered, because the veil was never just cloth, it was culture, and cultures could be questioned, slowly, dangerously. Still, for many, little change. In remote villages, in rigid homes, in places where poverty or religion or fear still ruled, the bridal veil remained a curtain between freedom and silence. Even today, there are weddings where the bride doesn't speak a word, where the veil is lowered by trembling hands, where the ceremony is filled with smiling guests, but the girl behind the fabric is crying, where her body will be taken as if her signature on the marriage contract replaced her voice. Modern gowns, modern music, ancient pain. The horror never really disappeared, it just found new disguises. Now, it hides in the pressure to smile through it all, in the belief that a woman must be grateful even when her autonomy has been taken, in the cruel idea that suffering is romantic if it ends with a kiss. And the veil? It's still sold in bridal shops around the world, still lifted with trembling fingers, still lowered with tears behind it. But some brides, more and more, are choosing not to wear it. They are walking into marriage with their eyes wide open, with questions, with conditions, with names that remain theirs. And sometimes, when the veil is handed to them, they fold it carefully and say, "No, thank you." And for the women who never had that choice, for the girls locked in bridal chambers, for the women who gave birth and died unnamed, for the wives who lived in shadows, this quiet rebellion is everything. It is a whisper through time, a rustle of fabric that says, "I see you, I remember, I refuse," because behind the bridal veil was never just lace, it was silence, and silence, finally, is being broken.